Well, I've got a patch on that Film Advanced lever. It's not original Leatherette, it's actually leather, but it looks close enough, as close as I can achieve today anyway. Yeah, and it looks better than the original one with the letter L carved across it for no good reason. Just trying to get this spring in position in this catch so it's armed and ready to go. Lower that into position and get that screw run down. If for any reason you think that that spring popped out of position while you were lowering it into place, don't tighten the screw up, take it off and start again, because if you crush that spring under something, you'll never get it to work properly again, and it's easily done. So if you've got any reason to suspect it didn't go perfectly, stop and do it again. Alright, that's good. Anything else here we need to be concerned with? Oh, we haven't put that rewind knob back together, I suppose, even though I'm not putting it on the camera just yet. Put a wipe of synthetic grease on the spring, the wavy washer, put the outer over the inner, run the screw down, tighten it. That just needs to be screwed on by hand. Okay, let's put the body to one side. We're done with that for the moment. I'll clear this mess and we'll get on to the shutter. Okay, let's start with this lens and shutter assembly. So we'll have the retainer ring off and the shims. The shims, we've got a metal shim and a paper shim. Separate those, they're very sticky with oil. The rear group unscrews with my fingers. That's good. The front group just unclips, just bayonet it on. They came loose nice and easily. And here we have our shutter. The shutter blades are obviously oily. You can see oil seeping around the edges of those blades. That'll be one of the reasons that it's quite sticky. Right, from the front of the shutter we'll remove the screw that locks the retaining ring. Very careful with that little black screw, it's easily lost. And of course with anything that's easily lost and was made a long time ago, there are no spares. Is there a solution if you've lost that screw? Yes, you can just put a touch of lacquer in each of those three spots and that'll lock that ring and keep it in place. Right, so that's off. Pull these other front rings off. This is just the shutter speed settings cam plate. Have that off. And we're into the shutter. Shutter release lever can come off. This little latch can come off. That prevents you from being able to depress the shutter if the shutter's not cocked. This is the cocking rack for all practical purposes. Here's the main cam. And start stripping some stuff off the mechanism plate. Remove the self timer. That'll need to go in the ultrasonic. I'll remove this main spring. The main spring is quite tired. Take the cam out. That was quite sticky, that cam. It's graphite grease, but it's the medium is dried over time and so is tacky, too tacky. Means it probably makes a marvellous lubricant, but it creates a lot of drag at the same time, which is no use at all in a shutter that needs to move quickly. Okay, let's have these pieces off. This is mostly flash sink mechanism and part of the release action. Be careful here not to lose tiny screws and tiny springs. Springs being the hardest of it. Take that lever off and get this spring off here. Now, I normally put the tip of a screwdriver at the back here of that lever so it can't swing out the way, and then I've only got to stretch out that spring a tiny amount to unhook it. Otherwise you can end up stretching it out for miles chasing it. Now there's something on that lever. What's that? Corrosion? There was something on there and there's a patch of corrosion. I don't think that's going to be a serious issue, but it's certainly unusual. Furthermore, what we want, there's the pallet wheel that can come off. That was gummy. I'm going to unhook the springs here. I'll put a toothpick over the centre so it can't ping off into space while I'm disconnecting it. And on the B lever, this spring here needs to come off. That spring acts on our settings lever for our flash sink settings. Here's their B lever, and the B lever return spring is this one. Again, I'm going to be cautious not to launch that into space. That's the front of the shutter dealt to, basically. We want the outer shutter case off, so we've got 3 screws. And there's a little screw here that clamps the flash connection. That's a little bit over enthusiastically applied, that. Okay, so there's our case. Now, starting to dig a bit deeper. 3 screws here. They hold the diaphragm setting lever in place. Now the diaphragm blades are obviously oily. This is all very oily. That's all just gooey with oil, so that's certainly going to need some cleaning. Oh, everything needs cleaning, some parts worse than others. And 3 screws here hold the mechanism plate and the case together. And these are reluctant to move. Unusually so. Alright. Ooh. These are tiny screws. Why someone's done them up this tight is just beyond me. Because there's always a danger of just shearing them off. Okay, so this doesn't want to separate. It must be stuck with oil. It is. Look at the state of that. See that gleaming oily look? That's oil. This plate, likewise, completely covered in oil. That diaphragm, yeah, it moves. It's reluctant. Okay, So these bits are all going to have to be carefully cleaned to get rid of all the oil and filth out of them. That should be absolutely dry in there. There should be no oil, nothing that looks like oil. Right, so let's disassemble this. I don't believe we're looking at oil that some naughty person has squirted in. This is all most likely oil that is sweated out of the focus helical. You may remember that I said the focus helical was exceptionally well greased. Well, all that grease carries the oily solvent, and all that stuff has found its way in through the back of the shutter, I think. So all of this stuff needs to be cleaned. You see those diaphragm blades are stuck together. They shouldn't be stuck together. To get all this oil off and then reassemble that diaphragm. Well, this is one greasy shutter. The components of the diaphragm had obviously, well, one of the components, the moving plate, had obviously been greased with graphite grease, I think, from the looks of it, very generously. Now, normally it needs nothing, or a very light wipe at the most, but it was thick grease, and that is almost certainly the origin of the oil all over the diaphragm blades. So I wasn't sure whether the shutter had been serviced before or not, because there were no other obvious signs of that, but that leads me to believe that yes, in fact, someone had serviced it, and they had a big pot of graphite grease and they weren't afraid to use it. It was a mess. But at least there's no corrosion. Given the level of oil everywhere, that's hardly surprising. Get this case in place. I had to be quite careful about cleaning the screws even, because they were so oily. Normally that's not an issue. So I'll check once I've got this diaphragm finished that it's all moving smoothly, and then move to the mechanism plate. The mechanism plate will doubtless be just as well lubricated . Let's see if that's made any impression. Oh yes, that's a little bit better. It opens and closes nice and smoothly now that it's clean. And this mechanism plate, well, let's tip it out. Shutter blades don't want to fall off, they're glued there. They don't want to come apart either, they're glued together with oil. You can see liquid oil on that plate there. That's no illusion. That's greasy. So it would appear that someone was exceptionally free with grease. Oh, and they were also pretty free at tightening things up tight too. Let's see if I can get these components clean. These shutter blades they're just really stuck together. I think they are cleaning well enough. They just looked a bit stained with oil. But I think it is cleaning. But that's looking good, so I expect these will clean up as well. I'll work away at it. Well, fortunately the mechanism plate was not as greasy as the diaphragm mechanism, which is a little bit unusual. But it's all to the good. I'll just get this mechanism plate reassembled. Hook that detent spring behind the post. It seems unusually stiff. Get this lens tube fitted. And fit the 3 screws. There are 3 very similar screws that hold this lens tube in place. The longer of the 3 screws goes through this bracket. Don't mix them up. It's not good if you mix them up. Okay, that all moves nice and freely. I'm going to tighten those 3 screws up and lubricate this with a little bit of graphite powder. And I have some loose in this container because this is where I tend to do this job. Just drop some in there so it gets between the mechanism plate and the blade actuating ring. And work that backwards and forwards to work that graphite powder in. And I'll just go and blow that excess out. Well, I've just put those shutter blades back in place. Not sure how much you missed there. Unfortunately, I put the blade actuating ring back in place on the mechanism plate, lubricated it with some graphite powder, blew out the excess graphite powder, put the blades in place on here, and when I looked up, the camera wasn't doing anything. So, but I think we're in good shape. Let's get this case in place. So I'm not seeing any serious issues here apart from the excessive amount of oil that was present. Perhaps the screws were unusually tight too, I suppose. Right. That's quite good. I think I've got a bit of staining on that blade there. I'll see if I can see the back of that. Right, just to pick something up off the paper I had it sitting on. Yeah, that looks better. Okay, so that's moving quite nicely. I need to put a wife of molybdenum paste on that detent for the blade actuating ring in particular, because that's quite strong, that spring, and it would have a lot of friction if it wasn't lubricated correctly. And I'll lubricate these two spots where the main cam picks up that blade actuating ring. That seems to be running very well. Okay, I'll clean up the other components and start reassembling all the components to the top of the mechanism plate, I think. It's all looking pretty good. The diaphragm opens and closes nice and smoothly now. That was just awful. I'll start by putting the springs back in place. This is always somewhat fraught because they're very good at disappearing, some of them. So I'll hold a toothpick over the middle here so the spring can't take off. I'll hook it behind that lever. It's not seated correctly. Now it is. Check that that's correctly placed. Both these levers are sprung. That looks good. Now the B lever return spring is here. And this fits into a groove on this shaft. Pull that back into position. And if I move the blades, open the blades up, I can get the B lever fitted. Because by opening the blades up, that allows this B lever to drop down into position. I've got to get the spring that I've just put here hooked into the back of this B lever and get the B lever seated on its post. Unfortunately, grabbing slippery components with slippery tweezers is tricky. Yeah, okay, that's seated. And the screw that holds that in place has a spring on it that acts on the settings lever for the flash sync and self timer. So I'm going to get this screw in position. And swing the spring up and over against the inside of against the lens tube here. Check that that's in position, hold back the B lever, I can pull back the blade actuating ring back to the rest position. So that's working fine. The pallet wheel, let's check that that moves smoothly. That seems good. the little sector gear that drives the pallet wheel, I'm just going to put a touch of molybdenum paste on the end of that little catch so that it latches and releases smoothly. Let's get it behind that catch. That'll do. And I'll have to hook its return spring into place. I'll need my needle nose pliers, hook it over the post there, stretch it out, drop it into that little hole on the arm, and if I move the blade actuating ring, that runs down instantly. That's good. And that little running down business there, that creates the delay between the flash contact making and the shutter blades opening when you have it set to the M flash sync setting. Alright, that looks good. So, what do I want to do now? Oh yeah, okay. So, the settings lever for our flash sync and self timer. I'll just put a touch of molybdenum paste on that detent. I'll do the same for this little ratchet teeth here. Put the lever in place, making sure the pin goes behind that spring previously mentioned. That's looking good. This shim goes on here and it can only go on one way round. This doesn't appear to be sitting as flat as it should do. No, it's alright now. Okay. And the setting lever for the diaphragm. There are 3 screws hold that down. It's looking pretty good. I'll get the 3rd screw in position. Sometimes if the setting lever has been distorted by somebody being a bit heavy-handed changing the aperture, the action can be stiff. That moves nice and freely and no problems there. Okay. Right, some internal stuff. Let's get a few more bits and pieces in here. This little spring-loaded lever helps drive that flash sync mechanism. Get that seated on its post. I put a touch of molybdenum paste on that. The moving flash contact goes on the top of that. I cock this. I can fit this catch in place. And just get the screws for that. Plain screw at this end. A return spring and a shoulder screw at this end. Must make sure that the spring doesn't get trapped under the shoulder, that it's free to rotate around the shoulder. Otherwise it won't work properly. You lift this spring up and hook it into the back of this arm. A little notch in the back of that arm that it hooks into. So that's now sprung loaded. Okay. Where is the shutter release? I'll put that in place next.